So then, welcome everyone to the July 2023 Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our guest this evening is Dr. Tony Burke. Tony has appeared twice on our Bible and Beyond podcast. One of those was called Why You Should Read New Testament Apocrypha, and the other one was 2 years ago when he talked about the Shapira Deuteronomy fragments and whether they were forgery or authentic. You can look those up on the Early Christian Texts website. Tony is a professor in the Department of the Humanities at York University in Toronto, and he's the co-founder of the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, or NASCAL. The society is currently involved in projects related to Christian Apocrypha and the early Christian Apocrypha. Tony's the editor of the book series New Testament Apocrypha, More Non-Canonical Scriptures, which is a collection of little-known and never-before-published texts in English translation. Before this night's over, I bet you'll all know the word Apocrypha. The title of our Bible and Beyond discussion tonight is Where Traditions About Jesus' Apostles Came From. Tony has just recently completed a fascinating new study on Apostolic Lists. You might think the study of lists could be rather boring, but if you've paid attention to the way scholars get their information from the past, it usually comes from very odd places, like receipts or graveyards. So tonight we're going to hear why these lists of apostles will help us learn something about them. And please don't forget how grateful we are for your ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. Our monthly podcasts, blog posts, and Zoom discussions actually cost time and money, which is why we need financial support every month. Your monthly donations on Patreon are especially helpful. So please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a monthly pledge that's just right for you. So welcome, Tony. We're so glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
To get you started in this sort of a cutting-edge scholarship, I just thought maybe Tony could start us off with a little bit, even explaining what the word Apocrypha is, and then we're going to get into the subject of the list. So, Tony, help us out with that word. I know some people obviously know that word, but not everybody. Could you help us out with that one first?
Sure. Apocrypha are texts written by Christians at various stages throughout history, not just early texts, about Jesus and his followers, so as the apostles and various disciples, so not just the 12, and his family members and others within the New Testament drama of Jesus' life. But these are texts that were not included in the Bible, or at least not most Bibles. There are some variations of Bibles throughout time and place, but generally these are ones that did not, so we might say, make the cut, either because the people who put together the New Testament didn't like those texts, or that they were written after the formation of the New Testament. And as I said, they were written throughout history. So people who study Apocrypha are just as interested in, say, the Gospel of Thomas, which is probably late 1st or 2nd century, as much as they are about the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which was a forgery made about, 10 years ago. All of these are the same type of thing. Use these characters in order to tell a new story for a new audience.
Okay, well then that sounds interesting right there. But also, I think most of us are really interested in knowing what happened to the people who were following Jesus after Jesus. And yet, as you point out, there's still quite a lot of research to be done. So maybe you could give us a feel for your latest project and how it connects us to a better understanding of the exploits of the apostles.
Sure. I'm working on a commentary of sorts, more of an introduction, I suppose, in a series called the Yale Anchor Bible series. They do these massive volumes on each of the New Testament books and such, but they want one on Apocrypha as well. So I'm doing this big book, and I have this habit of being very exhaustive, so I want to jam everything I can in there. And as I was working through some texts called the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, which I can mention a bit more in a second, I was looking at this phenomenon called Apostolic Lists. And one of the things I noticed about it is that few people actually examine them in much detail. There are collections of Apocrypha that are available. All the major languages have them. The French scholars put together collections with all the various Gospels and Acts and so on. Germans, etc., and English as well. Yet almost all of them neglect these apostolic lists. They just don't include them. And so like I said, I want to be exhaustive, so I want to include these as well. But going back to the Apocryphal Acts, so when we want to learn more about what the apostles did after Jesus' death, as the Gospels tell the story, we have the canonical book of Acts, which tells essentially the story of the apostles as a group, though about half the text focuses on Paul. But in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, we get writers who are expanding upon those stories, creating new stories. So where we have the Acts of the Apostles as a group in the New Testament, we have individual apocryphal Acts, Acts of Paul, Acts of Thomas, Acts of Peter, Acts of John. I think those are the first. Andrew, the first earliest are the 5. But over time, every apostle, every one of the 12 and more besides, get their own apocryphal Acts. And what I'm interested in with the Apostolic Lists is where the information in those lists overlap with the apocryphal Acts. Either the Acts are drawing upon these lists, or the lists are drawing upon apocryphal Acts, or they're both drawing upon independent traditions, shared traditions, or mixtures of all those things. Often these answers to these questions are not simple. It's not one thing or another. So that's the goal. It's want to talk about all of these apocryphal Acts in their various forms and where they intersect with these apostolic lists.
Okay, so you're showing us that the whole study is far more complex than probably most of us have thought about. And I do think that maybe, most of us who care about Jesus have probably been taught in our church communities that there are 12 male disciples. And yet, when we try to name them, most of us probably get 6 or 7 and then get stuck, not really sure of ourselves. Can you tell us plainly who the 12 were?
Mostly. So our earliest apostolic lists are in the New Testament, right?
Okay.
The 3 Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call them synoptic because they're very similar to one another. They have a list of the 12. And they're described that way. These are the 12 apostles. So it's like an inner circle of followers of Jesus. And they mostly agree, and they should agree, because scholars believe that these gospels are related to one another. Most scholars think that Mark came first, and Matthew and Luke copied Mark. So it's surprising when there's discrepancies. Why didn't Matthew and Luke just copy exactly everything that Mark gave? But there's some discrepancies. But as you said, most of us remember certain of them, and certainly those ones that we most remember are the people who appear first on the list. So Peter, the chief of the apostles, and Andrew, his brother. Then we get the 2 Zebedee brothers, James and John, sons of Zebedee. And next in the list generally comes Thomas and Bartholomew, who are fairly well known. But yeah, the rest of those are less well known. Certainly, probably most of us know Judas Iscariot, who was the bad apostle. But what about the rest? Not as well known for sure. But let me just talk about the discrepancies too. Yeah. So Mark and Matthew have an apostle named Thaddeus. Again, one of these not that well known. But Luke doesn't have Thaddeus. In his place, he has someone called Judas, son of James. Also in Luke's list, Matthew and Mark have a character named Simon the Canaanian. In Luke, his name is Simon the Zealot. So that's a little bit of a difference as well. And then we come to John, and John, which is doesn't share the same types of material as the other Gospels, is a very different text. It does not have a list of the 12 at all. Only, I think, 7 apostles get actually named. And we see more information about certain apostles than we find in the Synoptics. We get lots more information about Thomas, lots more information about Philip. But we don't get the list of the 12. So we don't know who the writer of the Gospel of John thinks of as the 12, though he does name one character named Nathaniel, who's only in the Gospel of John, as an apostle. He calls him an apostle. So it makes us wonder what would be the rest of the names of the apostles, according to John. Now, Christian writers don't like discrepancies. They don't like contradictions. So over time, the traditions, various church writers have looked at those lists and they've tried to harmonize them. So they would make such statements that Bartholomew is Nathaniel. There's no reason to say that in the text, but they want to figure out if Nathaniel is an apostle, according to John, then which apostle could he be that is also in the lists of the other 3 texts? And Thaddeus becomes Judas, son of James. So they're not 2 characters at all. It's the same guy, just with different names. So there's lots of efforts to try and fix those kinds of inconsistencies so that there aren't any questions left behind for Christians that could, I suppose, harm their faith if they see some kind of textual problem within the text.
Well, then, okay, so that's interesting that the Christians don't like discrepancies. Why do you think there's so many lists in the first place? Can't they just sort of tell us who they were?
And well, when you get to these apostolic lists later on, which develop they do this harmonization in the lists, but they also include other information. And yes, you have lots of different ones. And the differences in part are based on regional interests. So, for example, the Church of Armenia, they credit the establishment of Christianity there to two apostles, Thaddeus and Bartholomew, two of the lesser known ones. So they put an awful lot of information in their list about those two apostles. They will say that they established the Christianity in Armenia, but the Western texts, not in Armenia, won't say that kind of information, but they might say other things. For example, a list that was created in Greek in Byzantium, Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, gives an awful lot of prestige to the Apostle Andrew, because that serves their interests. So there's those kinds of things that are important, like the establishment of Christianity in their region, but also there's the types of information that we see in the lists serve other interests as well. Pilgrimage was a huge economy in the ancient world. So one of the reasons why we have these lists is to tell exactly where these apostles had their resting place. So it's not just listing the apostles like the New Testament Gospels do, but information that's important. So where did Bartholomew die? Where did Thomas die? How did he die? And that kind of information is good for Christians to understand and know so that they can plan where to go to kind of be in contact with these apostles, where to see relics, where to see churches built in their name, and et cetera. So the list, no list is ever merely a list. There's always a reason for them. And some of those reasons are, pilgrimages, festivals, establishment of various forms of Christianity within particular areas, things like that.
Wow. Okay. So that makes me more interested in the lists themselves as to why you got so interested in getting involved in these lists. You've made a point about the connection between the lists and the Apocryphal Acts. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about why there's a connection between these lists and those acts?
Sure. Well, the Acts, as I said, they tell about the exploits of individual apostles. So Thomas, for example, goes to India. And there he preaches and performs miracles. And eventually he's martyred. Almost all of the apostles get martyred at the end of their acts. I think John is the only exception. He digs a grave, jumps in it, and then falls asleep, basically dies. But no one kills him. I guess he just thinks he's done enough. So the Apocryphal Acts also have those types of interests about locations of death, circumstances of death, and sometimes dates of death, so that we have this support of the pilgrimage industry. Where the lists come in is what we're trying to determine is are these lists taking their information from Apocryphal Acts as almost a summary list, or are the Acts taking some information from the Apostolic Lists? So, for example, does Thomas die in India because the Acts of Thomas declared that, or did the Acts of Thomas take it from a list that was circulating prior? And I think most of the time, though, I think we have various kind of combinations of those, where we would have a list that would have some information that maybe an Apocryphal Acts took stuff from, but then a later list expands that list, taking stuff from the Apocryphal Acts to flesh it out further. So it can be this kind of complicated back and forth over time as the lists progress. But one of the reasons that this kind of thing is interesting to me, because I'm very interested in this kind of a blurry line between what's canonical and what's non-canonical. Mm-hmm. And the lists often show up in what we might call canonical contexts. For example, they often appear in Bible manuscripts as supplementary materials. You may have seen modern Bibles that sometimes have maps in the back, right? Or other reader's aids. Well, this would be like a reader's aid. It would be this list within Bibles, but So that makes it canonical, right? That makes it authorized in some respect. But the information in those lists comes from non-canonical texts. So I really like that kind of dynamic and how that works. And there's lots of examples throughout Christian history of what we might think of as authoritative Orthodox Christianity borrowing things from apocryphal texts. And the article that I circulated, the blog post, makes that point at the very end. Orthodox church writers are very willing to pull stuff from apocryphal literature that suits their needs and just discard the rest. So they don't like certain things in them, but there's some stuff that's really helpful. And so there's this love and hate relationship between orthodoxy and these apocryphal texts that I'm quite interested in.
Wow. So I just want everyone to know that we are putting in the chat here the link to your article, which I have read and found quite fascinating. It might be a little bit scholarly language in there a bit, but I think after we hear Tony, you'll be able to follow the article really well. So thanks for being with us to explain your way through this. So what you make me curious now about what might be the earliest texts that you have run across, and where would they've come from?
The two earliest is one called the Breviary of the Apostles, which is in Latin, and another one that we just call Anonymous One. There's no authorship on it. Okay. And both of those are around 500 or so fairly early, but not super early. So the Breviary one, the Latin one, there's about 15 or so manuscripts of that. And many of these manuscripts are kind of a compendium of various supplementary materials, but not within New Testament manuscripts. They're just various lists of festivals and various other various bishops and other things that are part of larger Christian tradition. Included in that list, again, it's never just the list, never just the names, but we get the meaning of each apostle's name. So that kind of an etymology. What does this name mean? Okay. Where they preached, how they died, when they died. And it also has a few other people who are not just of the 12. Paul is in there as well, so we get information like that about him. James the Just, the brother of Jesus, who wasn't one of the 12. And Matthias, the guy who replaced Judas. And Judas is not in the list. Judas, I don't think Judas ever appears in the Apostolic Lists because they don't care about Judas anymore. He's dead, so they don't want to create a festival or a church in his name, so they don't need that kind of information about Judas. So that's the earliest Latin one. And then the earliest Greek one, Anonymous One, is only about 5 Greek manuscripts of that. And that's mostly because the other Greek lists just kind of adapt and replace this earlier one. But this earlier one is more interesting in a sense because it gets us earlier into the tradition. So 5 Greek manuscripts, a few in Ethiopic, and a Latin version. But this list, most of the information that's found in it comes from a writer named Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote a history of the church in the 4th century. So he's an Orthodox writer, and he has little nuggets of tradition, things like how James the Just was martyred, how Bartholomew took the Gospel of Matthew to Armenia, various things like that. And most of Anonymous One is that kind of information. It derives it from Eusebius. So it's weird that we have a list that's using, not weird, but interesting, that the list is deriving the stuff from an Orthodox writer, someone within the church tradition. But it also then has some other things that are not found in Eusebius, including information about Titus, one of Paul's helpers, Barnabas, so not of the 12, but there are disciples, and the eunuch of Queen Candace, who comes from Acts 8, so a relatively minor character. And the interesting thing about this eunuch, we have no apocryphal text about this character. So our only non-canonical information comes from these lists like Anonymous One. And Anonymous One says about him that his mission area was in Arabia Felix and the island of Ceylon, which is in the Red Sea. And it's reported that he was martyred there. So this gives us a window into some traditions about the eunuch that never made it into apocryphal texts, or those texts no longer survive. So that's kind of a little bit of interesting information. So those are the earliest ones. Now, how good is this when it comes to history? Do these lists provide any historical information?
Right.
And I'm rather skeptical that the New Testament presents much historical information. And I'm not saying that to be controversial or a contrarian. It's just that people adapt traditions over time. It's just a natural thing one does. And we have this gap between Jesus' death and the first Gospels of about 40 years. And so there's lots of time for it to develop and adapt. So we don't know exactly what is historical. So the lists, these are, if the earliest is like the 4th or 5th century, this had quite some time to develop. So I suspect there's nothing historical in the sense of, did Thomas really go to India? But it is historical in the sense that the church, well, there's a Thomas church in India, but most of the information we get in the Thomas traditions are based in Syria, talking about India. So we do know that those traditions are important in Syria. So they have that claim that Thomas came there and that he went on to India. So that's historical in that sense. But did Thomas really come there? We don't really know. But certainly what's interesting to scholars is not necessarily what the history is, but what the claims are, why such a group would say this. What is it? What's the benefit of them? What are the outcomes of making these claims? How do they function? And those kinds of things.
Oh, this is helpful to get a sense of how you find history, because I think we're so inclined to say, just tell us the facts, tell us what happened, and we want to know that. So this is kind of helpful for you to show us that, that we have to be a little bit more patient with the things that we're reading to figure out what things mean. So in that line of thought, are later lists helpful also, or do you just really want the earlier text to tell you what's going on?
Well, we want both of those things, really. Every text has its own story, and sometimes even every manuscript of a text. So if we have, say, 10 manuscripts of a particular text, each of those manuscripts tend to have some variations among them. So each of those has some information, which is important. But let's keep down to the text as we can reconstruct them. Yep. Even the later lists have some information. For example, I got to think of what my example is. I have a terrible memory, so I'm looking at my screen as well at the same time here. There's a list attributed to a character named Dorotheus of Tyre. So we call it the pseudo-Dorotheus list. And his interest, he's writing somewhere around the 8th century in Byzantium, so Constantinople, essentially. And he's interested in connecting the Apostle Andrew to Byzantium because the Byzantine Church wants to assert its authority over the Church of Rome. They want to claim that they are the most important because they are two very strong churches. So this list is created in part to talk about how Andrew brought Christianity to Byzantium and started the priesthood there, or the bishopric there, I should say. He established the first bishop of Byzantium. And so to the crafters of the list, this makes the Byzantine Church more important than the Church of Rome. So even that late text has these late interests, but it's still interesting for us to trace the history of the church and the various conflicts. Like we have to keep in mind that we may all love early Christianity, and that's what my training is, but there's lots of scholars and lots of historians and lots of people who have interest in other stages in Christian history. Mm-hmm. So yes, Anonymous 1 is great for the 4th or 5th century, and we can play with that in that arena. But Byzantinists would be really interested in what Pseudo-Dorotheus of Tyre is doing, or what the Syriac lists are doing in Syria for the Syriac scholars and so on. So all of this material is useful to someone in their various academic pursuits.
Well, I think it's intriguing that you found such interest in lists. I'm sure I would have just gone right by the list and say, what else is new? So this is fascinating. So overall, did you, in your research of these lists, did you find that things you were finding kind of confirmed what you already thought and believed, or did you find some surprises, or how did you respond to these lists that you've been looking at?
Well, I'm not sure I really believed anything necessarily. I just wanted to see how these traditions kind of develop and how people are crafting the texts, either based on them or the texts are using other traditions. But certainly, one thing I like about doing this is the occasional surprise, right? Something that I didn't know before, or that just kind of amused me. And one of the lists that I quite liked is an Armenian list, so not very well known at all because there are not a lot of Armenian Apocrypha scholars. But this particular list gives the names of the apostles' wives and their children. And we tend to think of the apostles as celibate. They are, after all, the prototypes of Catholic priesthood, which is celibate. And so they like to think of the apostles as their predecessors in that regard. So here we have a list of apostles and their wives. Not all of them had wives. Some of them are said to be celibate as well, but some of them are. So we get Paul's wife, for example, whose name is Mariadon in this list. And he had 2 sons.
Paul that we know in the Bible? Is that Paul? Paul? Do you mean the Paul that we know in the Bible, or another?
The Apostle Paul. Yeah.
He was married and had children. Okay.
According to this list, yeah. Peter's wife was named Gogia, 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 and he had 2 sons and a daughter. Now, interesting enough, the New Testament does say Peter had a wife. So we know he was married, or it kind of says that. It says that he had a mother-in-law. So, of course, he must have had a wife as well. But that tends to get diminished in the Christian tradition because, again, we think of them all as being a celibate. So that's interesting. Well, I think, why is someone creating this list? And I don't really know exactly why. I think to some extent, there's never too much information. There's always gaps to be filled, and writers just like to add more all the time. That's why we get lots and lots of apocryphal texts. People just want to keep on adding more information. But it is an interesting preoccupation. But I like to think at least maybe there's someone out there, some writer in the church somewhere in Armenia, who was maybe a little less misogynistic or patriarchal as almost every other church writer in history, and had this interest in people's family lives, which is quite nice. There's another list that gives the names of everyone's parents. So some more backstory to these apostles. So lots of these lists will give these little bits of stuff that you would think that no one would really be interested in, at least not church writers who are, they're ascetic, they're monastic. They have their interest mostly in that kind of lifestyle, not in wives and children. So it's quite a nice surprise to see that.
That really is a surprise. You're right. It just changes our whole view of the way they lived, the way we think of them. So that is a very helpful kind of thing to think about. So just so everybody knows, we're in just about a moment, I'm going to turn this over to the rest of you to take over the interviewer chair. And but just I have one more question for Tony, and then we'll ask everybody else to join in. Do you have kind of a main message or summary that you'd like people to be thinking about from your work?
I guess I'll restate a point I made earlier. We often think of this dichotomy of Apocrypha and canon, or non-canonical and canonical, and that Orthodox writers have the Bible and that's all they read and that's all they care about. And then the heretics, the bad Christians, are the ones who write Apocrypha and who are constantly being told that their beliefs are wrong by the Orthodox. But that dichotomy is really not accurate. There's a lot of bleeding across those lines. We have, again, this is a good example of the Apostolic Lists. These are lists that are found in Orthodox contexts as supplementary material in Bibles. They sometimes get drawn upon to create decoration in churches. Both Apostolic Lists and the Apocryphal Acts, the stories are in the art in your churches. So the Orthodox writers will draw upon these texts. So whenever you see an Orthodox writer saying, don't read these texts, one thing it tells us that people are doing that, or they wouldn't have to keep telling people not to do it. But we also have to think their view is not the only view. There are other Orthodox writers who do want to draw on these texts. They don't want to declare them canonical. They don't want to say, read these on the same level that you read your Bibles, but they will say that they have some value, they have some information, and they have some great stories. And that's why they are so often used in art and plays and other aspects of culture. The Bible only tells us so much. So Christian writers embroider, add stories, and Christian artists draw upon those things. So never think of that as such a cut and dry dichotomy of canonical and non-canonical. There's lots of movement across that line over history.
This is really, really helpful to hear. I'm wondering if you might help us think about the connection. I mean, I think it's tempting to think that the Bible just sort of fell out of the sky after Jesus died, and there it was. And then you're talking about these earliest lists in the 5th or 6th century. So, and yet you're talking about this blurring between them. I know that I'm exaggerating the idea of the Bible falling out of the sky in the year 33 or something, but can you help us understand how there could be a connection? That seems like a big disconnect for the rest of us.
Sorry, I'm not clear what the question is.
Okay, well, I think that you're talking about the way these lists and the Acts of the Apostles are. You're making a connection with the canonical writings and the sort of apocryphal writings as not being so cut and dried different. And I'm asking you, since they seem so far away from each other, the way we've been taught them, can you help us understand, even historically, why they could be more of a blur, since we tend to think of the Bible as being really early and the others being really late?
Yeah. Kind of a quick rundown of dating. We see Paul was writing his letters somewhere around 50 to 60. Then we have the Gospels written somewhere between like 70 and 90 or so. And then the text towards the end of the Bible that not that many people read, letters of Peter, letters of John, some of Paul's letters, which were probably not really written by him, but written in his name. These come in the late 1st or early 2nd century. And we have some apocryphal texts that we think were written around that time too. A text called the Apocalypse of Peter, for example, maybe around 125. So you get this, think of the canonical text and non-canonical text as a bit of a Venn diagram, where there's a bit of overlap in the space where some material was written in both kinds of groups. And then we have something like the Gospel of Thomas, which some scholars like to date fairly early, maybe somewhere around the same time as the canonical Gospels. Mm-hmm. So what we end up with, if we let's look at, say, the first 2 centuries on the whole, rather than first century and then into the second, we have this time period of lots of writing about Jesus. Some of that material gets put in the New Testament. And some of that is probably the earliest material. That's fair. And it gets widely accepted by the end of the 2nd century, most Christian groups seem to value those texts. But then we have Christian groups that have other texts that they value. And so they have this kind of, again, this overlap, like everyone likes this kind of a core. And then we have groups that like some of that stuff and then some other stuff. And there's other group that like some of that stuff and some other stuff. And then by the time you get to around the beginning of the 4th century, you get this effort to kind of standardize an authoritative list for everybody, which means, again, we get that core, but we get some texts that are still kind of being worked out around that time. And then we have all the stuff that just gets left out. As scholars, at least, scholars of Apocrypha, but also scholars of New Testament, we try not to follow necessarily what the church says about what you should or shouldn't read. What we want to do is look at Christianity in all its variety and examine what each of these groups and each of these texts have to say. In part because if Christianity is defining itself by these are the texts we like, these are the doctrines that we like, it's also doing that by pushing out the rest. These are the things we don't like. So how better way to understand what the church decided it wanted than by also seeing what it does not want.
Right. That's exactly what I was hoping you might talk about. That's very helpful to hear you say that. Thank you. So now we'll open up to everybody else. If you've got some questions or comments or thoughts for Tony, then please raise your hand electronically. And I say that just because I can't see everybody on the screen. If I'm not finding you, then write something in the chat, and Maureen is there to help us tonight, who will pick up things that you might want to say. I do see in the chat a question that you might talk about, Tony. Grace Duffy is saying that she would like to see the list of the parents and the wives and the children of the apostles. How can she read that for herself?
Excellent question. The article that Shirley is sharing with you, it has hyperlinks in there for all of the texts that I mentioned. I think I do mention the list of the wives. And these links go to a resource in the scholarly association that I work with that Shirley mentioned, NASCAL. We have a website, and one of the resources on the website is called the E-Clavis, which is a list of somewhere around 300 apocryphal texts. So you see that list on the website, and you click on one of them, and it gives lots of information about each of these texts. So summaries, bibliographies, manuscript images, things like that. So if that particular list is not hyperlinked through the article, then just go to the NASCAL website, which is just nascal.com, and find the list, which is called E-Clavis, E-Clavis, and then look through the list and you'll find it. If you just search wives, you'll have an easier time finding it. And I think that one, like generally for these texts, I give summaries, but the lists, they are summaries in a sense, right? So most of the lists I just give in full. And so I think for the wives, I think the entire list is there.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And it's a great way for people to get to know NASCAL. And I would tell you that NASCAL is spelled NASSCAL. Am I right?
Yes. Don't write NASCAR. That's something else.
Right. Okay. Very good. Okay, Helen, I see your hand up. Go ahead, Helen.
Tony, I noticed that you did some work on the infancy gospel of Jesus, and I want you to tell me or explain to me why I should take it seriously.
Right.
It's almost like a comic book version of the story of Jesus. And what need was there in a community that would actually create something like that?
Okay. So the infancy gospel of Thomas. It is one of the most widely panned texts of the Christian Apocrypha. Whenever a scholar wanted to say how dumb and unsophisticated Apocrypha was, they would trot out that one and say, look at this, it's ridiculous. But a bit of a dangerous question because, yeah, it's my specialty. I wrote my PhD on it, so I could go on about this for hours. So I'm going to be very careful. I became interested in that text in my MA. I did a paper on it. And the thing that I was most interested in was, yes, we may think it's a bit strange today and a bit crazy, but people in antiquity valued it. And even throughout the medieval period, someone thought it was reasonable and other people thought it was reasonable too. And for people who aren't aware of the text, why do I keep saying it's weird and unsophisticated? So this is stories of Jesus from the age of 5 to 12. Not in the New Testament, except for the last story where Jesus is in the temple from the Gospel of Luke. And in these stories, Jesus is not the nicest child. Most children aren't, really. So he sometimes he heals people, sometimes he does nice things, but sometimes he does nasty things like children kind of do. So in the classic story I like to cite, Jesus is walking through a marketplace and a boy bumps into his shoulder, so Jesus strikes him down dead. So not exactly the kind of thing we read about in the New Testament, or is it? So what I was trying to figure out with it is how would it be read by ancient people? And ancient people, they had biographies of other figures like philosophers or emperors or various holy men of different kinds. And I found that for one thing, those texts would often have curse stories as well. So various heroes of those texts would do something similar. But I also found that biographies, they want to show a consistency of character, that the adult person does the same things when they were a child. And this is a kind of thing we often see in fiction, where something that a child does foreshadows their later life. It's a nice little literary kind of trope. So whoever wrote the infancy gospel of Thomas must think that the adult Jesus would also be a cursor, or it wouldn't make sense, right? We kind of work that in reverse. Someone's writing this text as Jesus is a child, so he has to do the type of things that Jesus would do. But Jesus in the New Testament doesn't curse anyone. Or does he? He does curse it for a fig tree because it didn't have fruit. Poor fig tree. Never hurt anyone, but Jesus cursed it. And he pronounces woes on cities that don't believe in him. What's a woe? It's a curse. Bad things will happen. And there are woes in Luke's Beatitudes as well. So, blessed are the poor. Woe, blessed. What's the opposite? Blessed. Anyway, something against the rich. Woe to the rich, I think it is. And the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament has several curse stories. Ananias and Sapphira held back money from the church, so God killed them with a thunderbolt. Paul blinds a false prophet named Elymas. So I think all of that is in the head of the writer, that this is a perfectly acceptable way to present Jesus. And if you work through the text, sorry, this is my last point. If you work through the text, there is a development in that text, not from Jesus being a nasty kid to a good kid, but the people around him start to learn that he's something special. And that's how curses tend to work within all of this literature that I was mentioned. A divine figure can bless or curse, and both of those are demonstrations of power. So the people in the text start to say, this guy is something special. And I think that's the point of the text.
The other thing I think I've learned about all these things, Tony, is that we cannot look at all these texts as if they were history books.
Yeah. Or from our own particular perspective, which is not the same, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Helen. And if anybody else has any questions or comments, raise your hand. In the meantime, I see another one. Go ahead, Bill Sweet. Go ahead.
Hi there. Two quick questions, and very interesting. These writers, do you think they had any idea of other writers, or they had no clue? They were just all on their own on an island. And concept of maybe someday these will all be compiled, or they just had no clue that this would be compiled. And the other one I have is someone told me that Luke wrote an Apocrypha. Is that correct? Did he write a version of the Apocalypse?
Did you say Luke wrote an Apocalypse?
Yeah, I heard that he wrote a version of Apocalypse too. Did I get it? Is that inaccurate? Someone told me that.
I don't think there's an Apocalypse of Luke, but there are lots of apocalypses of other characters. So there's an Apocalypse of Peter, Thomas, who else is there? The several of Matthew. There's quite a few of them. If you look on that list, that NASCAR list, and just they're at the top, really. They're A's, Apocalypse of. You'll see a bunch. I don't think there's one of Luke, though. The other question about... Oh, sorry.
These other questions was... the other one was, when they were writing these letters, did they have any concept in their mind at all that these would end up as a compilation sometime?
No, I don't think they did. I don't think the writers, or at least the writers of the New Testament, had any sense that they were necessarily writing something that we would call scripture. Early Christians had the Hebrew Bible as scripture. They only started writing things, down, and in part because Christians were dying, and because the second coming of Jesus wasn't coming as they thought it was. So they should start writing some things down. And they were just writing down things that were kind of memory aids to a certain extent, writing stories that they knew about Jesus. Paul was writing letters to his churches to help deal with problems that arose. He wasn't thinking that he was writing scripture either. He also thought the end was coming very soon. So there's no sense of writing scripture. Therefore, there's no sense of necessarily thinking that these things would be compiled. But later Christians, once writing Christian-only texts caught on, they started writing supplements to those texts. So the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, for example, is essentially a supplement of Luke, because it has that same story at the end, Jesus at the age of 12, but it's got the stories are between the ages of 5 and 12. So it's after the infancy narratives in the New Testament, but before the Gospel of Luke's story about Jesus at 12. So it's a supplementary text. It's meant to flesh out something that wasn't there before. Now, again, were they thinking? I don't think any of those people were thinking about things being collected together, but they were certainly thinking of adding something to what's already there, and that could be read by other Christians as supplementary material to a library that they already had, right? So there's a sense of collection when you're supplementing such a thing. I think I'll leave it there. I think that's the best way I can answer that.
Yeah, thank you. And we have DJA iPad. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are, but go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. This is Diana. Hi. Basically, one reason there's all this emphasis on celibacy, that didn't come until later. And it had to do with the church in Rome had no control over the priests or anything like that. And because the bishops were appointed by the authorities, like the kings, the nobles, etc. And quite often they were put into place because they were controlling large land grants that had been donated to the church. And they were supposed to be contributing to the armed forces of the king. Well, as a result, the church was falling apart in terms of its actual original mission. And so the German emperor would go down to Rome because Rome was actually, like a mafia house in terms of all the nobles down in Rome. And he would go down there and straighten it out and get popes appointed that were going to actually have the priests being good. Well, after a while, the Pope decided, well, there's a Pope that gets in there, decides, I'm going to make sure the priests are good, and I'm going to make sure that only the Pope and the bishops are appointing the priests and not the other way around. So there's a lot of give and take that takes place. But that's, how come the Roman Catholic Church ended up being so powerful, because they ended up putting the fear of God into the kings and the nobles, that if they didn't go along with the church, they get excommunicated, which meant nobody could talk to them or have any dealings with them. And then later on, Martin Luther came along and said, well, maybe there's other things that need to be done in terms of keeping the church safe and moral too. So it's not an easy process that came automatically. Once the church and Peter and Paul went to Rome, it didn't automatically become the church that we know. And the whole emphasis on getting a gospel or a Bible was a long period of effort put in by, like people like St. Jerome that went and lived in the East and learned how to speak and read these languages, and then came back and because everything was in Greek, and they wanted it to be in Latin so that the people on the western part of Christianity could read, the priests and the bishops could read the texts and understand them. And then, of course, later on, Martin Luther said, well, you should have it, in the individual's nationality, nation, the Germans, the English, the French should have their own Bibles. So it wasn't like some immediate thing that took place. It's a long history that is behind all of this. And then in terms of
excuse me, I just want to stop you a second. I want to make sure we have enough time for other people to make comments too.
So if you okay. I just want to say one thing is that the Eastern Church insisted all along that the priests were married, because they didn't trust men that weren't married.
Tony, do you have any comments about this?
I think it's a good point that there's no guarantee from the early period that the church would have such an emphasis on celibacy for the priesthood, at least anyway. But we do have a lot of interest in early Christianity by certain groups in celibacy, and that people like the Marcionites, Gnostics, they thought of the world as an evil place, and the best way to put an end to this evil place is to not have children anymore, to kind of roll back creation. So the what we would call Orthodox Christianity, though, did not like that idea, in part because if people stop having children, we stop having Christians. So they wanted people to still have children, but they still championed celibacy for people who were interested in a monastic life or a priesthood or something along those lines. But yes, not every Christian denomination favored celibacy for the priesthood. But most of our apocryphal texts are written by monks, by people who have taken vows of celibacy. So frequently that lifestyle is celebrated in these texts. And we have the apostles in the various apocryphal acts going from place to place, telling people to not get married, to not have sex with their partners. And that causes lots and lots of trouble within the society. So a lot of the teaching in those texts deals with celibacy, and it gets the apostles in trouble. But it's certainly this lifestyle that's championed by those texts. But that's not the lifestyle for everybody. And so the Christian groups that did champion such things, they tended to be persecuted by mainstream Orthodox Christianity, because it was not to Christianity's the interest of longevity for everybody to choose celibacy.
I've noticed in my own reading of the apocryphal writings that many of the apostles appeared to be martyred because they were telling women not to have sex with their husbands, and their husbands got really mad and said, get rid of this guy, right?
Yep, precisely. That's almost always why an apostle dies in these texts.
It wasn't just because people didn't like them for who they were, it was because of that one issue. So, all right, Sarah, let's hear. Yeah. Thank you. Sarah, go ahead.
Going back to the original Jesus and his 12, it almost sounds like, well, maybe imagine him as a teacher in a classroom, and he has 12 desks. And the first 5, 6, 7 are filled by these people that stay there. And are the others kind of like a revolving door during his ministry, where some people might leave the group and other people might join to fill the 12?
That's a good question. Yeah, sorry. Our earliest mention of the 12 is by Paul, but he doesn't list all of the 12. He does mention a few of the apostles by name, so Peter and James and John. But if let's leave the Gospels out of it for a second. Our earliest source is Paul. Who are the 12 to Paul? And it's not exactly clear. Now, when we get to our first Gospels being written, so Mark and so as our first one, we have the 12 listed. But is that necessarily the 12 that Jesus appointed, or is it some kind of office within the church, which may have a bit of a revolving door, but they're trying to establish the origins of that 12? Yeah. And there is some revolving door in a sense too. And when Judas betrayed Jesus and then died, he was replaced by somebody else. He was replaced by Matthias. So there is this sense that the 12 needs to be the 12, and so we need to fill a position. But I do wonder historically, who were those original 12, and are they necessarily the 12 that are listed in the New Testament? So there's that revolving door. And one other thing to think about too is the Apostolic Lists, because they are trying to harmonize and fix contradictions. One thing that they do also is they tend to elevate Paul as one of the 12, even though he wasn't, but he's listed in that group. And James the Just, he's not one of the original 12. He's Jesus' brother, but he was not one of the 12, but he gets put in there as well. So we often see in church decoration 12 apostles, and Judas, of course, is not there, but Paul is, so that he can fill that space. And I think James the Just is he becomes equated with James, son of Alphaeus, who was one of the 12. So there's that kind of revolving sense in a way too, is because Paul is so esteemed, he's got to be with the among the 12 in some way, right?
Thank you.
I also want to ask you, Tony, what about Mary? She's in the Gospel of Mary. She seems to certainly have been one of the important apostles, and also the other writings have Mary as a very important leader. So what do you know about lists that include any of the women, even like Thecla or others?
Yeah, we don't have apostolic lists that include women, unfortunately. Even the long lists that include lists of the 70 disciples that Luke mentions, none of them are women. Again, patriarchal monastic interest, right? But we do have texts that champion them, like you're saying, so the Gospel of Mary. And if you read the Gospel of Mary and you knew that Jesus had an inner circle, Mary certainly seems to be in that inner circle, because there she is teaching Andrew and Peter and others. And there's a text which is somewhat related to Gospel of Mary, is the Pistis Sophia, which is a dialogue between Jesus and various apostles. And Mary Magdalene, or Mary of some kind, it's a bit ambiguous, asks a great number of those questions. So just by looking at the texts and trying to see who's important, certainly some texts have these women who, not just Mary Magdalene, Salome also is another woman who's prominent. He is interacting with them almost like they are apostles, but not in the lists, unfortunately.
The only list I'm aware of that there's in the Manichaean Psalm book, there's Thecla is mentioned in that list, and that one is the only one I know of anyway.
That's interesting to think of that as a list. I should think about that a bit more. But yeah, there is a section which talks about important women who interacted with apostles. So yeah, Thecla is named, and there's about 4 others, I think. Yeah. And their stories are all told in the Apocryphal Acts, like Thecla is in the Acts of Paul, and these other characters are from other various Acts. So whoever wrote those Manichaean Psalms knows Apocryphal Acts texts and is excerpting little bits about those particular women, which is quite nice to see.
Yeah. Okay, Helen, you're back again. Let's see you.
Just a very quick question. Sure. You had mentioned, Tony, that Andrew was an apostle in the Gospel of John, but the Gospel of John doesn't call them apostles. You know, the Greek is disciples, And I don't think the Gospel of John is interested in the apostles at all, let alone the elite 12, although he does talk about the 12, I think in John 6, but it's almost like a traditional material. And then, of course, the last chapter, which is not really legitimately John.
Mm.
So, you talk about the 12, but it's really just that little cluster of the Synoptic Gospels, and they're all related to one another. So there really isn't a deep tradition of this elite group of 12, except that the church picked that up and kind of carried it forward. And I almost get a sense that there's a tension between the Gospel of John and the disciples, that community. And this is very Raymond Brown, and the 12 that seem to be coming together in the tradition of the church.
Yeah,
so I guess my question is, in terms of you trying to figure out who the apostles were, I think that the Gospel of John has a lot to say against the idea that there is some 12 originally.
Well, certainly, if I sometimes with my students have them do thought experiments of, if this was the only gospel you had, what would you
Exactly.
believe? So yeah, let's say the Gospel of John is the only text you have. There is no concept of the 12 in there. And you're right. I was just looking at John 21, and I mentioned Nathaniel as being an apostle, but he's with apostles that we normally think of as apostles, but he's not called an apostle, right? And no one is called an apostle. They're called disciples. So it's a very good point. Like, do we see in John this somewhat contrary position against the idea of the 12? But our earliest texts, like Paul, certainly knows the title of apostle, and he even gives it to himself. But that is more of a church office, more like an evangelist, a missionary, a preacher, than someone who's necessarily in an elite class above others. So there's different ways that the term apostle gets used in our sources, for sure. But thanks for pointing out the lack of the use of the term apostle in John, because I haven't considered that.
This is great. Well, I hate to cut this happy party off. We need to keep going here. Does anybody have any last final questions or something? Otherwise, yes, we do. Okay, Bill, go ahead. One more.
Yeah, I was wondering, these letters to the churches, were they to a minister or to a board of directors or a board of two bishops, or to the whole congregation? It says to the churches. Did everybody get to read them, or just one person or a select group?
It's a good point. There's a really good stand-up comedy bit by Eddie Izzard. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but he talks about Paul writing his letters, and he makes this point about who gets the letter to the Corinthians. So Paul writes this, and he sends it off, and no one wants to touch it. So I don't want to read about what Paul says. Everyone's avoiding the mail. Like, yeah, who does it? Who is the one who receives the letter? But in the New Testament, we have at least a couple of examples. 1 Corinthians is a good one of how do these letters kind of get transmitted. And someone named Phoebe comes from Corinth to Paul with some people as a kind of a delegation. It's nice that it's a woman who leads this delegation. So she brings to Paul this letter, and she will take the response back to her church, and there it will be read to the congregation. So that gives us a sense of how at least this one historical situation is done. When we get apocryphal letters, so letters written not in the New Testament, they are written by people in the name of Paul, in the name of John, in the name of various other characters. They are, of course, presenting a completely fictional way of transmitting the materials. And if we only have the letter by itself, we don't really get a sense of what is in the minds of our writers, because the letters themselves don't necessarily tell us. It's just John writing to so and so. So the 1 Corinthians example is a really good one of it does show that kind of the backstory, but generally we don't get that kind of information. We have a letter which is a fictional situation trying to get an idea across with a fictional writer and a fictional audience, but how exactly it works, we're not really told. Certainly in antiquity, though, letters would be mailed to people. We have copies of private correspondence, which indicates that someone would basically give a letter to someone who's going on the way. So I know of someone who is going to Toronto, and I will say, here, can you take this letter to my friend Janice? She lives on such and such street. and then that person would get it there. Or there was also a Roman mail service, which would be somewhat similar, but that would only be for citizens and kind of an official usage. But the regular everyday people would just find someone who's going on the way and transmit it that way. So that gives you a bit of a hint of how things might work.
This has been so much fun. Yeah, I think what I really like so much about this, Tony, is that you're helping us feel like we're getting to know the people and their lives and the impact that they had on the church and on the people who are trying to follow Jesus and what it meant to them. This is just fascinating to open up the windows and doors for us like this. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So I need to wrap things up here, and I want to just thank everybody for your participation and your great questions and thoughts. This was the July 2023 textual study for the Bible and Beyond discussions, titled "Where Traditions About Jesus' Apostles Came From." That's what we're doing tonight. All right, just to make sure that everybody knows that from 8 to 9 p.m. on Eastern Time on Monday nights, we provide a discussion on a topic related to early Christian texts. And we ask one of our knowledgeable scholars to share their knowledge and insights and provide time for participants, time to ask questions and share their own thoughts. For those of you who may not be so familiar with all the things we do at Early Christian Texts, we encourage you to visit the website. Check out the podcast where you'll find Tony Burke again. We also have blog posts and longer articles and in-depth courses that you might be interested in. And you no doubt realize that this all costs time and money to be able to produce these Bible and Beyond textual studies. So all of us extend a special thanks to those of you who have pledged your support on Patreon. Please, if you're not already a subscriber, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a monthly pledge. Next month, Dr. Sarah Maurice Brubaker will join us for a conversation about Augustine and what Augustine gets blamed for. Augustine represents a kind of the pivotal point between antiquity and the next phase of Christian theology. So Sarah, a wonderfully dynamic speaker also, will help us figure out why things happened the way they did in the evolution of Christian history. And that'll be on Monday, August 21st. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Tony. We sure do appreciate you being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's fun.
Thank you.